welcome to bright and early. I suggested that we do these keynotes at 4:20 to then allow for more late wake-ups. But in any event, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Celeste. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for having me here. So as Celeste said, my name is Harry Resin. I lived in Amsterdam for almost 18 years. Been cultivating for nearly 20 years now, and have had the good fortune of basically seeing the evolution of cultivation through the ages, so to speak. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Might be a bit on the basic side for those that are more advanced, but I want it to be more general to sort of give you an overview and a historical look at where cultivation was versus where it is going. Was working earlier, I promise. All right, so when I started cultivating, most cultivators were cultivating in a closet or in a spare bedroom or a room in their house, sometimes in a garage. The likelihood of you having a large facility was very small, typically because it was illegal and you would get busted, and why would you put millions of dollars into infrastructure if you knew within 6 months to a year you would be getting it shut down. So the evolution that I've seen has gone from simple tents and home setups to now good manufacturing practice factories that have thousands of lights and that are spitting out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. This discussion is going to be an examination of what was so that we could see where the foundations of this industry were into the evolution of hopefully where the industry will go. No. I have it the wrong way. Look at that. Technology works. So typically, you would find people that would grow their own stash. That's kind of how it began. Typically, as I said, in a closet or in a tent. Tent came a little bit later. Usually, it was a closet. You'll see by the next few pictures that it was usually also a very rudimentary setup. The lights were CFL, fluorescent style lights, sometimes even just home bulbs, until high intensity discharge lights started to make their appearance and started to be adopted. As well, your plant count was usually a lot smaller because you were buying seeds. It was very hard to get seeds. You would have to order them from Amsterdam or from somewhere else. They'd have to come in. You'd lose some would not germinate. So it was usually a small amount of plants. As well, there was not the wide range of nutrient companies that you see today. So people would go to their local nurseries and local home gardens and use what they could. And it was always hand-watered or fed. Now, that is something that I'm very familiar with. And thank you to most of you that you will not ever have to go through that, because that is not going to give you the best buds, but as you can see, there is still something. After a few years, improvements started to be made, and tents in one way was a revolutionary step, as well as this particular, anyway, and the bottom right picture, the light hood, which you could see is an adjust-a-wing light hood. I'm going to come back to that. But these were some of the more modern advances of what I'm now calling Cultivation 1.0. So typically you had a single adjust-a-wing hood in a smaller tent. These lights used external ballast, which would be placed outside the tent or room, which meant that you could reduce the heat. You usually just exhausted and had positive or negative airflow, depending on what your preference was. And the adjust-a-wing gave you a much greater coverage, so you could fill your tent, have a big canopy. The tents were amazing because in Amsterdam especially, where you knew within 6 months to a year that at some point you would get busted, the tents you could just throw up, take down if you needed to move. They were very quick to set up, very quick to take down. Then probably about 15 years ago, you started to see these light movers coming into play. And I remember a garden in Canada, in Montreal, was in a guy's basement, and he had 52 individual tables set up, roughly about 5 feet by 5 feet, and he would roll these tables under his 2 lights that were moving on light movers, and essentially he would have a harvest once a week, and everything would be in a perpetual cycle. It was one of the most fascinating early gardens that I'd seen in this period of cultivating 1.0. Towards the end of this cycle, there was a guy in Holland who invented a system called Opticlimate, which was essentially a wraparound cooling-based technology, which was one of the first revolutionary systems. He also predated the Gavita with the world's first dual-ended 1,000-watt light. I'm going to come to some pictures of what those looked like. Once people started to introduce a more advanced system that had monitoring, their yields would jump exponentially. So I knew people that were averaging about 1.7 pounds, so about 35 to 40 grams per square foot, and they went up to about 60 to 70 grams per square foot. So it definitely made a huge difference. This is some examples of what the light movers looked like. Again, the picture on the left is a really, really early example of even using the old hyperbolic lights, which somehow were never recommended. Up at the top, you have a ceramic metal halide, and on the bottom left, Gavita. This was the Opticlimate and dimlux system. So what made this system unique is on the right, you had an all-in-one unit that was both cooling, dehumidification, and heat. And as well as I said, it used water as a coolant, so it effectively was passing the air and then cooling the air using the chilled water, and was one of the early examples of wraparound technology found in a cultivation room, as well as the dual-ended lights. And most importantly, it had a monitoring device which also allowed you to control temperature, and then there was a sensor in the room. So you could essentially dial in your temperature to such a degree that it never fluctuated more than about 8 or 9 degrees. And that level of stability is what gave these early growers a chance to really boost their yields and improve their cannabis. Now we come to my favorite period, Cultivation 2.0, or the cowboy period, especially in California. And once medical came into existence about 15 years ago in America, we started to see people spend more money and build larger scale gardens because now they had the backing of their medical licenses or their medical permits, their patients, and less facilities were getting busted. So when I moved to San Francisco about 5 years ago, I'd seen some gardens, and I was like, wow, this is, how long have you guys been in here? Wow, 10 years, 12 years. I'm like, what? Like, in Amsterdam, coming out of that, we'd be lucky if we got a year. So it really allowed people to take their time to experiment and to develop their skills as cultivators and as well as room builders. And a lot of these people are now designing the rooms for Cultivation 3.0 and have entered the space as consultants and have helped as well adapt and develop new technologies that have also improved situations. So these facilities typically had about 100 to 500 lights, and then those rooms were subdivided into smaller rooms with about 25 to 30 lights. That gave you a more manageable space, so gardeners that were going from 5 to 10 light setups could easily scale up because it was more manageable to deal with a 30 light room rather than 500 lights all in one go. Additionally, they could control pests, mold, mildew, and spider mites, and usually involves some type of automated irrigation. This was still predating the adaptation of a dosatron or a more automated feeding system, so it was usually a garden variety type of timer that then allowed you to irrigate through pipes into your individual plants, which again for a hydroponic system or a mixed soil cocoa / hydroponic system, it also gave gardeners a leg up because they could spend less time in the garden watering and had more time to actually work with the plants, look at the plants, and play with them. Here are some photos from the 2.0 cultivation phase. Again, I don't know what's going on with these hyperbolic lights, but it seemed to be a fad and indeed carried over into 2.0. At the top left as well, you'll notice that somebody's in a lab coat. This was, again, depending on the level of cultivator, in the medical era, you also had people that were starting to understand that they were cultivating medicine for people, and as a result, they really needed to take a different approach. They had to be a little bit cleaner in their gardening. The rooms were cleaner. They were as well bringing more tidiness and controls into the rooms. On the bottom in the middle next to the awkward looking light, you have a dosatron system. This was sort of the next evolution after people started to experiment with early automated irrigation systems. They moved to a more automated system which actually allowed for nutrients to be mixed and also allowed for greater metabolism and greater yield with a lot of the plants. And again, the whole point of all of this was to move towards a degree of stability, because as we know, other forms of medicine, to have consistency, to have homogeny is very important. In this period as well, there was a company called Bedricon, which some of you may have heard of. They had a Canadian license that got bought out by Canopy. They were the original Dutch cultivators with a medical license. And they had come from years of farming. They were white endive farmers. They really had a good grasp of indoor cultivation. And they were one of the first gardens where you really saw a crop-to-crop standardization when it came to cannabinoid ratios, when it came to height, when it came to terpene and flavor profiles. They were really one of the first few to adopt ISO 9001 certification. So some highlights of Cultivation 2.0 were lighting technology and irrigation. Facilities now, once they were being built in the last 5 years, 10 years even, typically the Gavita light became very popular. This is a light that you could hang at a much higher placement away from your canopy. You could have a much greater spread of light, as well more and more use of the dosatron system, because people were finding that it was easier to set up an automated irrigation system, as I said, to devote more time to actually being in their garden rather than watering. They would be relying on that. As well, monitoring systems started to really come into the marketplace. I was an early adopter with a system called SmartBee. Essentially, it was a cloud-based monitoring system that you could access anywhere through a mobile app. You go onto your web browser and you could see a week, a month, and up to 6 months worth of data, which really allowed the growers to start to better understand environment and start to better understand things like vapor pressure deficit and creating ideal environments for your plants to thrive in. Essentially, what we were doing with indoor cultivation was we were replicating the outdoors at the highest, most extreme levels, so you could look at it like a professional athlete in a way working out in a less gravity-based environment where they could lift more, pound more on, and that's what we were trying to do with the plants, create greater yield, higher levels of THC, which now you see some plants topping out over 30%. So clearly these techniques have had a very good influence on the industry. Also, rolling tables were a major factor, increasing the square footage of your cultivation space, greater canopy, dispersal of the light, and as well, you now no longer had wasted space in your cultivation rooms. Here's some examples of the later stages of 2.0. This is a garden from Colorado, and the picture on the left is maybe 1 or 2 weeks into their veg cycle, and the picture on the right is them fairly late into flowers. So as you can see, from a very spread out type of placement, your canopy really fills out. The Gavitas are much higher up. In fact, they're stationary on the ceiling. And again, that's a typical Gavita light, and they really crushed it with giving us far better THC ratios, cannabinoid ratios, and terpene profiles, and as well greater yield with our plants. Now, the exciting part, Cultivation 3.0. So, years ago, people were talking about LED lights, and I'm going to come to what the very first LED, in fact, the very first LED light is on the bottom right, was known as the UFO. Some of you are familiar with it. Usually it focused on the more red colors and the red spectrum of light, which later we found out was not necessarily the best and why LEDs were not working so well. So some highlights of Cultivation 3.0 is that now with the large amount of capital that was coming into the space, people could literally design the rooms from the ground up. They were now going to different sectors in agriculture, adopting products from all aspects of commercial agriculture and saying, hey, we can be using this as well. And the rooms were getting to the point that we're at now, which is GMP type facilities, clean rooms, facilities that were segregated so that you only worked in one part, so you wouldn't bring pests into other parts. There was no more retrofitting of quote unquote legacy gardens. That's our new term for the illegal market, the legacy market. And retrofitting is a big deal because unless you're going in and building from the ground up, you don't know what's under that. We took over a facility, we had to bring it up to code. We tore out the old garden, and it turned out that we were in San Francisco and the previous gardeners had decided to take out one of the structural beams of the building because it didn't actually fit with their gardening plans, and had there been an earthquake, the entire roof would have collapsed on the garden. Thankfully, we fixed it and the landlord was cool, but again, you never know what you were going to find. Also, with Cultivation 3.0, saw companies like Fluence, which I'll get to, develop LED lights that were mind-boggling. I would never say this if the proof was not in the so-called pudding, and I'll show you some photos of a garden in San Francisco that I had a chance to visit that was phenomenal and all LED. The other improvement that LED brings are dual and in some cases triple or quadruple stack gardens depending on your ceiling height. Now, what are the benefits of a stacked garden? Well, essentially, I'm going to show you some pictures. Here we go. This one. So with a stacked garden, you increase your square footage by utilizing as much vertical space as you can rather than old sort of weird, awkward vertical growing systems. This allows you to really grow in the same way that you would, only you're stacking your tables. What this does is it effectively doubles and in some cases triples your output. I highly recommend it. The lights are incredible. The technology today is fantastic, and I strongly believe that the future of cultivation will include only LED-style gardens. I'm going to come back to more of that. But again, for the bottom line, and right now with a lot of companies going public in Canada and in different places in the world, output for an indoor cultivation is a huge thing, especially in California where the price of real estate in some places is through the roof. So if you said to me 10 years ago you can go from 35 grams a square foot to 70 or to 105 by going vertically, I would have laughed because the technology wasn't there. Now it is, and if you're building a facility, I highly recommend looking into it because to go to your investors and say that you could double your output or in some cases triple your output is a big deal. So, the old school LEDs, as I said, were lower wattage. The newer ones are typically around 600 watts. The old ones were around 200. I'm going to come back to this towards the end of the presentation where I talk about sustainability. Fluence is more of a broad spectrum light. When you go into the room, your eyes are not really burning just from the intensity, but not from the weird colors. It looks like normal white light. They also have a larger footprint. So one Fluence gives you about a 4-foot by 4-foot canopy versus these tiny little laughable UFOs. But something has to predate the next technology in order to improve upon it. So LEDs, again, as I mentioned, increases yield. You could double or triple stack using giant shelving systems that were typically found in archival rooms. There's a few companies out there that are building them. They'll come into your room and they'll give you a custom situation. The other aspect that we're finding now more and more is that LEDs actually give you a more consistent cannabinoid profile. They increase potency in both terpenes and cannabinoids. This has been a study done by these cultivators called Eve, which has this LED facility in the pictures that I'm going to come back to. What's very important going forward, especially for the pharmaceutical part of this industry, is not just having GMP practices, but also having consistency. Because if we're looking at going to a pharmacy and selling medicine, well, you're not going to get a volume that one day is less potent than the previous day. It's going to be consistent over all the years that you're taking that product. The same now needs to be the case of cannabis and cannabinoids, because we're now using it and relying on it. And in many cases, people that are medical patients need to know exactly what they're taking so that they can keep taking it and not have to change their dose or experiment. Again, the rolling shelves provide a maximum degree of canopy space. As you can see, none of the space is unused. The shelves roll into each other, so your entire room is covered, maximizes your space, and I believe will really be the future of what we look at as far as cultivation. These are some examples. The one on the bottom right is obviously an amazing looking type of situation, and I do believe that in the future, now with hemp coming into the Farm Bill and being accepted again, that you're going to start to see a lot of large-scale facilities really look at the way in which they are cultivating to both maximize their profits, maximize their yields, and create the cleanest, most effective medicine with the most degree of stability. One major aspect of Cultivation 3.0 are new advancements in technology. I've been doing some consulting and we've been doing some webinars with a company called MSRP. They are one of the early creators. The person that I've been working with has about 5 or 6 patents in the industry, and they strongly recommend a wraparound, pre-cooled dehumidification type of system. They had contacted me because I'd written an article about vapor pressure deficit, which basically is the ratio between temperature and humidity in a garden. And what we're now finding is that that is ideally the number that you should be programming into your sensors, and the best cultivation sites right now will be growing according to the VPD of the room rather than to temperature and humidity as single elements. Another important aspect to the wraparound unit is that it is incredibly efficient. So to come back to the LEDs are essentially saving you about 25%, not per se in cost of the LEDs, but overall, as you now no longer have to heat or cool the room to such a degree, the temperature is a lot more stable. With this type of dehumidification system, you can also have a greater degree of efficiency, which to your bottom line will increase your profits and lower your costs, because you could save about 25% on your energy costs. Now, I'm going to come into sustainability at the end to even potentially lower your costs to almost nothing on the electrical side. Another problem with the traditional cool heat dehumidification systems is that they tend to give off a lot of heat in the room while your lights are on. Now, what we've discovered is when the lights go off, if you're using a traditional cool heat system, you'll often find a spike in humidity, because what's going on is the lights are going out and the temperature is dropping. As the temperature is dropping, your humidity is rising as a causality. So the key with these systems, the wraparound systems, is they can also boost the heat as the lights are going off rather than as just a byproduct of the machine. They're actually looking at the temperature, looking at the humidification, and keeping that VPD always in range, which will see fewer spikes in your humidity, which will then allow for less mold and mildew, because as we know from powdery mildew, it can thrive in an environment where there's too much variation in humidity, too high or too low. So again, this is very much a lot of what I talked about, the traditional cool heat, which is one of the most famous. Quest also can dump a lot of heat. It's hard to control the temperature. And with today's modern advances in monitoring systems, you're going to start to see a lot of aspects of AI coming into the picture, where now with all of the data that you're collecting through these monitoring systems, the AI will help you on a strain-by-strain basis discover what causalities in temperature and humidity lead to better yields, lead to higher cannabinoid ratios, and essentially you'll be using science to better affect the way in which you grow and to better affect the medicine by which we are now all using. So what does the future hold? Well, I'm happy to say sustainability. I believe that going forward, as we are mostly leaders and, dare I say it, coming out of the more liberal hippie aspect of society, sustainability is a big factor for a lot of us. And if it's not that side of it, then it's the bottom line side. And the reality is if you could save on your electrical costs, you're cutting down a major, major cost when it comes to indoor cultivation. A lot of this is being adopted in Europe. You see it a lot in Holland, where they are one of the world leaders in indoor cultivation. The reality is, with today's solar technology, today's solar batteries, wind turbine, you could essentially create a facility that is almost net neutral, where effectively you are creating your own energy, not relying on grids, not relying on having to pay large bills. And I think for us as leaders now in an indoor cultivation space, we should really be putting our step forward and not per se demanding, but really looking at sustainability going forward. If you look at the packaging on the retail side, it is excessive in California. You're talking plastics, boxes. So to me, it's absurd that California is all up in the arms about plastic straws, and yet now they've introduced thousands and thousands of pounds of garbage due to the cannabis industry, which is meant to be based on hemp and sustainable and all of these things. Another important factor is the amount of water that we're using, especially in California, which for many years was drought prone. And effectively, now you're seeing people collect their water from their AC units, from their runoff, evaporated water that's being collected in the air. That water is collected and purified and now being reintroduced as in the nutrients. Composting is another thing. For a lot of indoor cultivators, this is very difficult, but for outdoor cultivators, you're seeing it a lot more. One thing, thankfully, in California that you're starting to see with outdoor cultivation is the concept of terroir, which you see a lot in the wine industry, where your actual soil and your profile of the land in which you're growing really gives your buds a unique flavor. So one of the things that we'd seen in Amsterdam is you could give the same plant to 15 different growers, and in some cases, grower 1 to 15, it will vary so much that you'll be like, wow, this is not the same bud. And that really goes to show you, I believe there's a talk after mine that really looks at the way in which certain cannabinoid profiles, certain morphologies of the plant come out as a result of environment. You see that, in fact, genotype, which comes to genetics, is very much affected by the environment that the plant is in. So composting will, I think, be a very big aspect going forward of the future of cannabis. So for me, I'm excited by what's coming because for the first time in my life, this is now a legal and not illegal entity, and people can talk about it, we can share. Learning and education is something that I strongly believe in. I believe that there's no such term as a master cultivator, which I find ridiculous. Maybe a master plumber or master electrician or a master in other settings. But the reality is, right now, I've learned more in the last 5 years than I'd learned in the previous 15 years by actually cultivating and just by being around people that you can share ideas with. One of the early stories that has always stuck in my head is, thankfully, living in Amsterdam, we would be the hotbed and the meeting place for a lot of cultivators. And at that point, years ago, there was only one Cannabis Cup. That was the only event every year. All these American cultivators would come to Amsterdam, and we would have this great meeting of the minds. What made that so amazing is you would have cultivators that realized, hey, you're that guy that lives 10 miles away from me. But in America, none of them could talk. So they would go into the hardware store and they couldn't acknowledge that they kind of knew that person because they could get busted. And I think that that really held back the industry, and you'd not seen it in any other type of commercial agriculture or other industries where the illegality of what we were doing really crippled the industry and crippled the advancements that we're now starting to see, because we couldn't go to companies like Dosatron or companies that were working in industrial ag because we couldn't access any of those products. If you look at some of the large-scale growing that's happening now in Salinas in the Central Valley in California, you see automated clone and planting machines that could plant hundreds, if not thousands of clones a day. And this has been going on in Holland for the last 50 years. And in fact, I remember there was one of the largest worldwide agriculture shows for commercial ag in Holland. You would walk into their main exhibit hall and you were talking maybe 20,000 square feet of just industrial ag machines. And I was like, wow, like no one is using this. But we just couldn't access that. And I think that now the key for all of us is to look to our peers, take these new advancements and not be afraid and not let ego stand in our way and say, hey, we're all in this together. The ultimate goal is to create a better product, to create an understanding in people that previously thought that this was pot or weed or some drug-based evil that, you know, they've held on to. Even my mom is like, well, don't smoke your pot. I'm like, it's not pot anymore. We're done with that. So I really strongly believe that, you know, I'm very excited by what the future holds, because for me the future is relatively unknown right now. You know, who knows what new technologies could come about. So we're in the most exciting times. So for the people that are new to the industry and the people that have been in it a little bit longer, let's not forget that the shoulders of the people that created this industry largely had to run, and in some cases got caught by the police, and a lot of us had to suffer, be it from stigma from the family. In fact, Harry Resin is a pen name, as you can imagine. And the reason that I created the pen name is because 15 years ago, my father ran a publicly traded company, and suddenly you'd Google and Netscape and all these things, and you could search my name, and I've written for pretty much every cannabis publication on planet Earth, so it would not be hard to confuse our last names, and then suddenly here's my dad, the pothead, which now, thankfully, he is, but in those days, he was not. So for me, you know, I really encourage a discussion, I encourage a dialogue, and I encourage all of you to take ego out of the game, because it's not going to get you anywhere. Anyone that tells you that they know everything and that they can't learn anything, I would not hire that person, and they are not going to grow good cannabis. So I now open the floor to all of you if there's any questions or comments. So I'm just going to wait. Probably someone's going to bring a mic. Oh, yes.
Oh, I will take this.
All right.
We want to get your question on video.
Okay.
Check, check, check.
So in the vertical farming, mobile shelving, is that mechanized?
No, at the moment it's not. They're archival shelves, so but you're talking the pounds per pressure to turn these things is tiny. Like you could use a pinky to turn it. I think in the future you're going to start to see more advances where they're mechanical. Maybe they move when you come into the room. But the problem that I've seen too is the more increase you have on the technological side, the more problems can occur. So I stepped into a garden and they stopped using their Dosatron system, and I was not familiar with it, and I personally don't like it. I actually like the hand watering because it really gives you a chance to interact with your plants. As a gardener, you need to be in there. You need to see under the canopy, and that's your hour every day to do that, even though you might be picking leaves off. And it turned out, and this person was not the brightest, that the entire system had been installed upside down.
So that would be a problem, and Dosatron will send out a representative
Right.
to support.
But I was like, we're not using this thing. It's a nightmare. I don't want to use it. I didn't even know it was upside down until, indeed, a friend of mine who works for SmartBee, who created the system, he came in. He's like, I know these things. Let me have a look. He's like, dude, these are upside down. I'm like, dude, that's why I'm not using this, because I didn't even know. Like, the whole building was going to fall down on my head. So again, you never know what you're going to open up. That's why I recommend really going in, forget the retrofit, build it from scratch, spend the money now to avoid the problems later.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted, last year I was listening to a panel that the investors that are investing said that they would not do indoor facilities. They didn't think that was a good investment. And then there was the opinions of what's going on outside growing, and then obviously with other countries and so forth. Do you have a kind of your own overview on that and how you would address that? If I was an investor, why I would even go down that path as opposed to the other way? And maybe how you would compare that? And
Absolutely.
describe that?
So let me give you a metaphor. 20 or maybe now 25 years ago, there was a guy in France named Bernard Arnault who invested in a little-known brand at the time, as you can imagine, called Louis Vuitton. And he combined that brand with Moet and Hennessy. At that time, fashion was not what it is today. People thought he was insane for investing in retail and in these defunct fashion brands. Well, who's having the last laugh now, as LVMH is one of the largest fashion and luxury companies in the world. So I strongly believe that indoor cultivation has its place, because the reality is I've seen some of the best outdoor cultivators in the world. I've seen some of the best indoor cultivators in the world and some of the best greenhouse cultivators in the world, and I've traveled to Jamaica and many different countries. I strongly believe that there's always going to be a market for a high-end product, the same way there is in fashion, the same way you could buy your clothes from Forever 21 or H&M, or you can go to a Saint Laurent or a Gucci. People are going to want both things. It's the same way that Bebo or Dosis can sell you a vape pen that has $10 distillate in it for $100. The reality is that the market is always going to want something that is beyond just producing biomass. So on the one side, if you're talking about scalability and you're producing biomass in order to produce distillate or other chemical compounds, CBN, CBD, then yeah, I completely agree. You're going to want to go to the cheapest place to produce the cheapest form of biomass. But if you're looking at it from this high-end product, it's the same reason I spend $6.99 at Whole Foods to buy the most gorgeous heirloom tomato that when I was living in Holland, I was like, I've never seen no tomato like this green and beautiful, and oh my God, but that's $6.99 a pound. But I'm paying it because I want to eat that. The same way I can go to a butcher and buy premium A Angus steak, or I could go to my special butcher in San Francisco and buy the imported Japanese A5 Wagyu at $149 a pound. Why do I do it? Because let me tell you, that $149 steak, you've never had a steak like that in your whole life. And consumers today that are coming to cannabis are typically a lot older. I'd say 35 upwards to even my dad's age, which he's now in his 70s. And if he's going to spend the money on a nice scotch or on a nice cigar, they're going to spend that same money now on a nice cannabis product. So I do strongly believe that you can mitigate expenses by going vertical, creating higher output to offset your cost per square foot. And I wouldn't necessarily build it in a big city like San Francisco or Oakland. I would go to the Central Valley. But I do strongly believe that there's a place for high-end indoor cultivation. Yes? Sorry.
Yeah, so why are the majority of growers still using HIDs for their flowering, despite the developments in tech and LED?
Ego. Because they think that LEDs suck. They've heard one thing. They're not scientific enough to actually go into the research. Lack of understanding is the reality. The same way I, for years, would write many articles that I've written for High Times where I was like, do not use LEDs. The technology isn't there yet. And then I went into a facility and I ate my shorts, so to speak, because I was like, wow, this is incredible. And then they're pulling out their COAs, and I'm smoking it, and I'm looking at these profiles compared to their other room, and you're talking 2-3% higher terpene and cannabinoid counts. So I think it's ego and lack of education. And in the next 5 years, you're going to see everybody moving away, which is why companies like Gavita, which is now owned by Hawthorne, they've made an LED. All these companies are doing that. Yeah, sorry.
Harry, first of all, great presentation. Thanks. I'm not a grower, and so this was super helpful for me. My background has been as an engineer focused on indoor air quality and atmospheric control. So the VPD, like I completely, support and agree with you there. My question for you and the other experts in the room is post-harvest, when the flower is in transport to the lab, to the dispensary, to the end user, how are we maintaining that VPD control and protecting the flower?
Well, at that point, if you've cured your product to a degree where tomorrow I'm doing a trimming workshop, so I'm going to go into a lot more detail on harvest and trimming. But the reality is, once you've gotten to the point where you're down to about 8-9% moisture left and you've cured your cannabis, I have stuff that's shelf stable in a dark room. I've had it for 2 or 3 years. The color hasn't faded on it, hasn't oxidized. You'd smoke it today, you'd be like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I think the issue is less with testing because they're picking it up relatively quickly and the turnover is now only a couple days. The greatest issue is perhaps the environment that it's being kept in a dispensary to ensure that your product now is the same as it is 6 months from now. And I think eventually you're going to start to see units and safe rooms that are built accordingly that have the right temperature and humidity in order to better store and archive your products. There was one over there. Yeah.
I just had a quick question on the wraparound dehumidification. Can that be integrated into your AC system, or is it always a separate freestanding?
It can be
unit?
integrated, and I can give you some contact details of that company as well. They also have smaller units, so you don't necessarily need to redo your whole room. You could take out your Quest and put their unit in. We're at the back. Behind you there was also someone.
Venture capitalists such as Alsop, Louis, Draper Fisher, or others benchmark investing?
Sorry.
Are venture capitalists such as Alsop, Louis, Benchmark, and Draper Fisher investing today?
Those three I don't know, but there are Peter Thiel's invested. There's a lot of venture capitalists that have brought money into the space.
How hard is it to get a pitch meeting with them?
Probably vary. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about same idea post-harvest, but more in the vein of the leftover product that's left in the facility. You had mentioned something about using that for composting to be able to feed the next generation and everything like that. I'm curious to know, whether or not you feel like there would be a market there for, like, because our company, that's what we deal with. That's what we do. We deal with plant matter and product after all of that is done. We can get it out of the facility so that people can put new product in. But if they want to use it for composting, do you think there's anything special that would need to be done with the plants so that to make them more usable, or would it just be a matter of shred them up, get them put into a tumbler or something?
I think ultimately the latter, but what you're going to start to see most likely is people that are in waste management that are now cutting deals with composting companies that are realizing, oh wow, actually this isn't waste, we can use all of this, and now you're going to be a broker selling that probably to other people. We also had one right here after.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you very much, by the way, appreciate that overview. I want to hit a couple of points and ask questions because I'm a little curious. One is biomimicry. Being able to actually do nature. I mean, we had the question a little while ago about indoor versus outdoor. The fact with LEDs, you don't get the UV. And you can get a little bit of UV, but obviously there's an interaction between that and the rest of the spectra. And that's what you see when you go outdoors, when you get high quality. Understanding that, what do you think, and I do appreciate the fact that you say there's going to be very levels of buying. There's going to be the blue dream, and then there's going to be the land races that people are going to be going after and getting really pure product. But I think also in the medicine issue, LEDs typically at 140 hours start degrading. The spectrum starts going. In 3 years, you have to replace them, most of them. And on top of that, you're talking about sustainability. Between the plastic that's inside that you're delivering the water with and the LEDs, there's not a whole lot you can do to recycle those currently. They're trying, I know. So I appreciate that. I guess my question, coming around to it, is in making good medicine, did you find that the outdoor grows in a living soil, not using salts? Because part of this is also the medicine you deliver. Even if you're doing large scale, you have to add something to make up for the fact that you're using a parking lot light to grow plants, 23% of the spectrum. So you've got to put chemicals in, and now you're delivering chemicals. So I guess my question is, in this plethora of products and the ones that you personally use, quality, where's that fit, you think, in the future? Where's it going?
Well, so the point that I was making with these sort of luxury companies is that I've smoked beyond belief the amount of cannabis that I've consumed. Most of you probably couldn't consume that in a lifetime. I have never smoked as good quality outdoor cannabis as I have indoor. The percentage of that is 0.001% because you're growing it outdoors. So there's a lot more bugs, there's a lot more pests. The modern LEDs make up for that by introducing a UV spectrum. And the reality is, I think that you're always going to have a side-by-side. There's going to be a biomass production outdoor. But the reason that Holland went to an indoor cultivator for their first medical garden is because if you're looking at that grade of medical plant, truthfully, the only really way to do it is in an ISO 9001 certified clean room. And you might be growing under a parking light, but that parking light has been specially created for cannabis with the right spectrum after hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of research and R&D. And I think in the future, they will be able to recycle the lights. The Fluence lights are actually rated between 5 and 10 years. And now that they've been doing tests long enough, they're seeing that you could buy a light once as opposed to buying a light bulb every 6 months in the HID lights. Now, from an efficacy point of view, okay, outdoors you have to spend less and you're relying on the sun, but you're also getting botrytis, you're getting a lot more pests and issues that you cannot control for because you can't dial in your VPD. You can't have as regimented a system in place for IPM, and now you have all of these hemp farms springing up. So you're going to have all of this cannabis pollen. Now you're probably going to have seeded crops in your outdoor. So there's a lot of issues that I would say are going to present themselves.
One more question.
It was right here, or I don't know if... He's been waiting for a while.
So I love that analogy you used with the high-end products. I was wondering, what is the industry doing, I guess, in consumer education and also weeding out bad actors? Because that analogy only works if consumers can trust the product and they actually know which products are luxury high-end. So I'd just like to know that.
Unfortunately, not much at the moment. We're really, in a way, sort of self-policing ourselves. The two brands that I mentioned, one of them is about to go public for $1.2 billion. Now, I had the pleasure at High Times of testing over 2,000 different vape pens over the last 4 years as a vape pen judge. Those are literally the worst vape pens I've ever smoked in my life. So, but that's not stopping Barney's from selling them. So the truth is that will eventually come. What you're seeing now is a lot of the insta-famous celebrity growers are now going to eventually not necessarily make it into this 3.0 because it's hype. It's a lot of hype. Yeah, great, you got 3 rappers to smoke your weed, but at the end of the day, they're not scaling up and they're not selling it across the states and building these brands that are going to carry them forward. So I think you're going to see a lot of new things coming and a lot of evolution where some brands that you're like, wow, these guys are getting involved, like the Gucci's of the world, like all these people are looking at cannabis as this new thing because you have this group of people that are attracted to this flower and now it's suddenly becoming more and more in the common domain. So I think that that's what you're going to start to see.